There were no welcoming whistles. No launch ceremony. No nameplate, just a massive machine of black steel was pulled out of the factory in silence. A General Motors diesel locomotive more powerful than anything American railroads had ever seen, but never allowed to exist publicly. In railroad history, people talk about cancelled trains, failed projects, designs that were out of date, but this was different. This was a locomotive buried because it was too right, too powerful, too efficient, and too dangerous for an entire industry. After World War II, America boomed. Railways remained the backbone of the economy, but they were dying. Steam locomotives were expensive, maintenance was complicated, efficiency was low, and General Motors saw an opportunity. GM didn't see railroads as a means of transportation, they saw them as a battlefield. If they could replace steam with diesel, GM would control the entire industrial lifeline of America. And they started with EMD, Electromotive Division. GM's first diesel locomotives weren't just better, they destroyed the competition. They required fewer workers, they were more fuel efficient, they could run continuously for thousands of kilometers. In less than a decade, steam locomotives were nearly extinct, but GM didn't stop. They wanted something no one could compete with. Inside a secret testing facility, GM began a project never to be mentioned in a brochure. A diesel locomotive's power far exceeding American rail standards, torque sufficient to pull a train longer than an entire town. Modular design, capable of continuous operation. Engineers informally called it the locomotive that ends competition. Not because it was perfect, but because no one would survive on the market if it were sold. When the first prototype was tested, things quickly spiraled out of control. The track shook like an earthquake, the joints cracked, the traditional braking system couldn't keep up. The locomotive wasn't limited by the track was limited by the locomotive. One engineer later recounted, "We realized the problem wasn't the engine, the problem was that the entire American railroad system wasn't built for this." If GM had released it to the market, they would have forced the entire railroad industry to rebuild its infrastructure, and that would have meant one word: war. The railroad companies didn't panic, they froze. No public protests, no lawsuits, only closed-door meetings, unsigned letters, and secret agreements. A locomotive like this would disrupt the freight pricing structure, kill small manufacturers, give GM absolute power, and that power must not exist. GM faced a choice, not a technical one, but a political one. Either launch the most powerful diesel locomotive in history and become a monopoly hunted by the entire industry, or bury it before it itself triggered a crisis, and they chose to bury it. No press releases. No publicly available archives. The prototype was dismantled, the documents were fragmented, some engineers were transferred overnight, only whispers remain, and a few blurry photos taken secretly in remote test sites. Because if this story were told correctly, it would expose an uncomfortable truth: technology doesn't die because it's incompetent. It dies because it's too dangerous for the current benefit. GM didn't lose, they won too big, and when victory threatens the entire ecosystem, it's erased from history. Today, when we talk about hybrid locomotives, superpowered diesel engines, high-performance freight trains, engineers are still inadvertently repeating ideas from that banned project. As if it never disappeared, only pushed back in time. Like smoky Unique, like the Ford GT40, like a turbine train, not a failure, but it's too soon to be forgiven. If GM were to release that locomotive onto the market, would American railroads dominate global logistics? Or would GM itself be destroyed? We'll never know, because there are machines, not banned because they're wrong, but because they're too right. Somewhere, in an unnamed archive, there might still be a piece of steel. A piston. A blueprint. An engine never allowed to roar, and history has been rewritten to suit the survivors. When people think of General Motors, they think of cars, Chevrolets, Cadillacs, trucks, muscle, steel. But for most of the 20th century, General Motors was not just a car company. It was something far more dangerous, because while Americans were looking at highways, GM was quietly taking over the railroads, not by owning tracks, not by running trains, but by controlling the one thing railroads could not survive without: the locomotive. At the start of the 20th century, the United States runs on steam locomotives. They are massive, powerful, romantic, and catastrophically inefficient. Steam engines require massive crews, constant maintenance, water stops every few dozen miles, round-the-clock servicing. A steam locomotive doesn't just pull trains. It consumes manpower. By the 1930s, railroads are bleeding money and they know it, but replacing steam isn't just a technical problem. It's a cultural one. Steam is tradition, steam is identity, steam is jobs. So the industry hesitates. General Motors does not approaches railroads the same way it approaches cars, not as machines, but as systems. They don't ask, how do we make a better locomotive? They ask, how do we make railroads dependent on us? The answer is diesel. Diesel engines use less fuel, run longer between services, require fewer crew members, start instantly, can be standardized, and most importantly, they can be mass-produced, something steam locomotives never were. Doesn't build diesel locomotives at first, they buy their way. In 1930, GM acquires Electromotive Company, later renamed Electromotive Division, EMD. This becomes GM's railroad weapon. EMD doesn't sell locomotives the old way. They sell solutions, financing, maintenance contracts, parts supply, training, long-term dependency. Railroads don't just buy a locomotive, they buy into GM. The turning point comes during World War II. Steam locomotives are pushed beyond their limits. Diesel prototypes keep running. When the war ends, the math becomes impossible to ignore. Diesel locomotives cut operating costs nearly in half, reduce downtime dramatically, to eliminate entire maintenance facilities, shrink crew sizes. Within a decade, steam disappears, and not slowly, and not gradually, or violently. Entire steam fleets are scrapped, roundhouses demolished, jobs erased, and GM becomes the single most powerful supplier in rail history. By the 1950s, GM controls the dominant diesel locomotive designs, the supply chain, the spare parts, the maintenance standards, the training manuals. Railroads begin to look eerily similar. Same locomotives, same layouts, same engines. Innovation slows, but profits stabilize, and railroads accept the trade. Here's the part history books skip. When one company supplies nearly every locomotive in a country, that company controls fuel standards, maintenance cycles, upgrade paths, obsolescence timelines. GM can decide when engines become outdated, when new regulations appear, when replacement becomes necessary. This isn't conspiracy. It's leverage, and GM understands it perfectly. Inside GM, engineers push limits: more power, more torque, more efficiency, but not everything sees daylight. Some diesel locomotive concepts are simply too disruptive, too powerful for existing rails, too efficient for existing business models, too threatening to stability. So they disappear, and not because they failed, but because they worked too well. One question haunts American rail history: why did the US fall behind Europe and Japan in passenger rail? Part of the answer lies with GM. High-speed rail requires new infrastructure, new power systems, new standards, and new suppliers. GM's diesel empire thrives on freight, not speed. Freight doesn't need 200 mph. It needs torque, reliability, compatibility, and diesel delivers all three. So passenger rail stagnates, and America becomes a highway nation instead. Electrification threatens everything GM controls: electric trains. Eliminate diesel engines, reduce maintenance, shift power away from manufacturers. So electrification stalls. In Europe, governments push it through. In America, it dies quietly. Diesel remains king. By the 1970s, oil prices rise, environmental regulations tighten, diesel pollution becomes visible. GM adapts, but slowly, because changing too fast means undermining decades of dominance. Competitors emerge, regulations bite, and for the first time, GM reacts instead of leads. MD is eventually sold. GM exits locomotive manufacturing, but the system they built remains. American freight rail is still the diesel-dominated, a heavy-haul focused, resistant to radical change even today. General Motors didn't just build locomotives, they reshaped an entire industry's future. They decided what American rail would be or what it would never become, and how fast it would move, not through laws and not through force, but through engineering, economics, and timing. History remembers inventors, visionaries, revolutionaries, but it forgets system builders. GM didn't revolutionize rail with one dramatic moment. They did it quietly, contract by contract, locomotive by locomotive, decision by decision, and by the time anyone noticed, there was no alternative left.